This is an event which was supposed to take place yesterday afternoon. I don't know how many of you were here already, those who have joined, for those who have joined. As Marcel Mettelsiefen, filmmaker and war photographer, not war photographer, photographer and a publisher of a magazine on the Middle East, was not able to return from Iraq as planned. We had to postpone the panel by 24 hours. To my right, Geimer, professor for the history of art and for the history and presence of photography here at the Free University of Berlin, and co-initiator of a research project about evidence, photos or images as evidence, as making things visible. I'll try to take up as much as possible from the previous panel, which was about the economy of images and of what narration costs for security, for example, and what is done with these pictures, under which circumstances they are made, and how people are paid, which make these pictures possible, not only as a photographer and filmmaker, but also as a fixer, enabler, with names which the consumers of the products in Western countries might not hear that often. People who have Arab, Asian or African names and whom we hardly see on pictures. I ask myself, in 2 or 3 films which we have seen, and most impressively in Marcel Offel's great film on a war reporter in Sarajevo, which was screened yesterday in the auditorium. And again we see a character of which I understand it might be something like the evil twin brother, or the dark counterfigure for the war photographer, a figure, a character that, after what we've seen in the past 48 hours in the events in Kiev, which was intensively in the media, without seeing it, the sniper, that is, under the immediate threat of whom filmmakers and photographers work. And he focuses and he tries also to find the right moment. Seeing and shooting are similar. You do not only shoot films or pictures, but you also shoot on photographers. Mr. Mettelsiefen, in your work, have you experienced something similar, which we've seen in these footage of the war in Yugoslavia? Film teams, photographers, which are suddenly under fire and have to cover themselves without knowing who is shooting them and from where. If I've experienced this, yes, very often, actually. A situation in which, in particular, the Arab Spring, and that was not necessarily part of my work, but in order to work from the region, unfortunately, there were situations when you had to go somewhere, and to get there, you had to cross roads, bridges, where there were snipers. And now in the Syrian-Libyan contacts, there are a lot of snipers. I'm interested in a question in this context, which I would like to ask you, Mr. Mettelsiefen. the aura or the role of a war photographer. I think we all, independent of our sector, we always confronted with ideas of what you do and what your own profession is and your job is. But very often as a professor, you might think they do read and write a lot, which is certainly true, but also we have to make sure that we get funding and do some administrative work. And a war photographer is a character which is linked to several roles, and one is certain an adventure. So you've got the present, it's the residue where there is still this character of an adventurer, which goes certainly back to Kappa, where he is famous both. We have pictures I've given it, you're not close enough. So the idea you have to be close to the event, and Kappa was killed, he died for his job. Another form you can see in War Photographer by James Nachtwey, which some of you might know, which gives you the impression he appears to be a lonesome cowboy. So he has seen so many extreme things that he has dropped out of all social settings. He can no longer function in an ordinary society coming back. And this is one picture or a cliché, but it's clearly linked to the role of a war photographer. But I would like to read a quote by Luc de la Haye, who in an interview said something very similar. He said, neither a bulletproof vest nor armored vehicle protect me, and when I use this, I'm as much in danger as those of whom I take a photo, and which gives me the right to be there, which I find quite interesting, the link he establishes. So he says, I'm always working under life threat, but this is legitimization for being there. And it would be interesting, how do you deal with these roles? What do you do about it with this cliché? I'm laughing, I'm smiling, because I try to make this clear, because I want to defend myself against this label of a war photographer. I think it's not appropriate. I have certainly this cliché in mind, and I want to position myself very clearly. Of course, funnily, the war reporter is very rarely an adventurer, or rather the photographer, which, Kappa, mud-covered with his Leica around his neck from the Vietnam War. And everybody knows that, at least since the film of The War Photographer by Nachtwey, which has established a picture of a genius who is on a mission and who is very much driven. I don't see myself as this spy. I meet these expectations, these stereotypes. What do you do which doesn't fit into this picture? Which is a surprising of these war narratives. They seem, even though we have heard this again and again in the past today, even though the realities of war reporting have changed extremely since the 1970s, these old images, cliches, which have shrunk to icons, still stuck when you select pictures or when it comes to our own expectations. Reality of today's wars apparently is not strong enough, in a very peculiar way, to overthrow these old cliches and to say that was yesterday, today is completely different. Even it's about news of something which we do not know yet. What's the question? It was more like a comment. So I tried to draw a professorial conclusion. You say this reality is no longer there, but the expectations, the stereotype of the cliché is still there. Well, a lot has changed if you compare Kappa's time with the media context in which we live. These are completely different worlds. We are talking of a new audience, people who are flooded by pictures a day after day. Kappa's generation was a pioneer region which could shape a discourse. Everybody knows these 5 or 6 great pictures which are linked to a certain generation or time, the child in Hiroshima or what have you. Today, this is no longer possible because it has become an enormous business. It has become so much faster. It's an industry in which I can only talk for myself, and that is why I try to position myself in the way I see myself. And even if you're interested in the issue, how can you find a justification to go there, to accept these risks because I'm interested and I have a journalistic impetus, or because I'm curious with respect to people? I'm also still searching. To answer your question, I believe that the cliché of a war photographer, the time when this cliché was created, can no longer be compared to today. And the dynamics and the costs are completely different. We depend on those who have commissioned us and pay us. As we also want to talk about images, and I would like to do this, and I would like to quote Donna Hay from the interview, who says the majority of all photojournalists claim that they did the job because it was important and because it was necessary to have the attention of the public and to focus on parts of the problem of the world. So it might be possible to solve these problems. I never believed in this. I think this is very pretentious. At the moment, when I take a picture, I am only concerned about taking a good picture. I would like to know, what are good pictures? What is the criterion? When is a war photographer, a war filmmaker? Dollar Hay, it seems to be very clear, and he also has sells his pictures in galleries. It has exhibitions, so it's an idea which separates the picture from the actual event. Then the picture has its own life as a piece of art, and this is out of an art context, but nevertheless, you have to answer the question of a good picture. You have to shape them. They don't take them or shoot themselves. So you have to take a good picture and have to make it good. What would be a criterion for you for a good picture? Well, first, you should look at the context. If it's only news, a practical single picture for the news, or if it's for a series, and that is usually how the categories are defined. If awards are given, the awards for the best picture of the year, for example, these are aesthetic factors. You probably want to hear this, so you can't but having some aesthetics, even though it's a situation of horror, to make a picture printable, because you're in a competition in the newspapers, among the newspapers. If you think how many pictures, thousands of pictures survive every day just out of the Israel-Palestine conflict are sent out, so a good picture has to be as good that it really is striking and gets the attention of the editor. So maybe we could look at some pictures. We heard of the press award, of the World Press Vote in the panel before. I usually don't like the pictures which are awarded. Why? This is Samuel Amaro's picture, 2009, taken in Yemen, or 2011, sorry. It shows a victim of a gas attack, and it's absolutely clear how this picture functions by retrieving Christian iconography. Everybody sees Christ and Mary, which is a very clear motive, and that is, I think, that the picture was awarded just because of that. And I'd say it's a picture which doesn't make you deal with it. You look at it, and then it's clear how to categorize it, and a lot of colleagues love this. They could write an article on this. However, I'd say it's a very extreme depolitization. So what this makes this picture a good picture is at the same time something that makes it unimportant as a war photographer. And here, this year's photo, here it's even stronger. Hardly anybody could tell what it is. You might say, a new religious group or aliens trying to contact their own galaxy. However, the picture shows Somali refugees in Djibouti which try to send or get a signal from home. This image is based on a certain idea of aesthetics. It just creates an atmosphere. I'm sorry to read a lot, but it's very interesting what I think. The photographer, Stan Meyer, who works for National Geographic, said in a Spiegel interview when he was asked about this photo, I have too much paper. He said the following. He says, we can see ourselves in this picture. During the time, I tried very often to reach my family, and I bet you know this. You walk through the house and try to get better connection. We all have the desire to link with those whom you love, whom are important. I can see my neighbor on the picture. I can see you and myself. I took a picture of myself, actually. It's a great picture, and this was really a stupid statement. I'm happy that you think that. Well, maybe it's not that easy. Well, you might say the statement is so silly that you don't even need to talk more about it, but it was interesting. I don't want to denounce him or to criticize him. But what is behind this World Press Award? It's the idea of these general human characteristics. We all know this. Don't you see yourself in this? And it's also a way to take the pictures out of the context in which they were taken. And that is, I think, what I expect of photos taken in a war, that I learn something about something specific, a specific conflict in a very specific time. And these pictures which are awarded do just the contrast. So it's in a very unspecific context. So it could mean anything. And I don't know if you know the family of Nan by Versteichen in the 1950s, a very famous exhibition which there was birth, war, death, and pictures from various countries. And the idea was, aren't we all people? Weren't we born all on the earth? But I believe if you talk about photojournalism and not in an art context, we should differentiate between the narrating and a news picture. And if you think a good picture is only valid and valuable if it shares news, you should only judge news pictures which are necessary and good eyewitness evidence to show what's happening. A picture like this, which what both did, and that is how a lot of photojournalists work, who try to use aesthetic, have an aesthetic impetus, and try to tell a story, which is, I think, the more interesting work, and that is where I position myself, to show. And you don't understand the picture as an individual picture, but it is a series of pictures, of which is one that he made this statement might be a bit unfortunate, but I think it's valid. Or strong picture yesterday, you said that you like the picture, which is finally a picture that was awarded, which doesn't show a child. Yeah, it was striking. I noticed that on this picture, you can't see the color of the skin of these people. How we recognize people, refugees from Somalia or from the Horn of Africa on the street and or in the underground, has vanished completely on this picture. Caroline has given me a paper here, and she asked me to ask you a question about the whiteness of the photograph. How white can it has it to be a good photo? Well, whiteness in terms of racism, or what do you mean? Pictures, as the one which was shown by Peter Geimer, have very strong black and white contrast, which makes the color of the skin of the injured person in the background so that it's no longer saturated or desaturated. So it's worthwhile to talk about the skin as a marker for being different. So first, we are not white in February, we appear different from August. And the idea that other people in other parts of the world look so differently. So, with respect to the effects of war photography, it appears to be necessary to have a clear reference. African pictures have to look in a certain way. When the blackness or the darkness or the difference of the skin and the physiognomy, something happens to the pictures. Well, it's become fashionable at WordPress, for example, and the consequence was that some pictures were disqualified. A lot of photographers tend to increase contrasts and reduce saturation. It's a kind of aesthetic which has been en vogue and has been used a lot for a couple of years. I don't think that the reason is to try to show by making the skin color similar. That's the way I understood this question. I don't think this would be a racist factor, if I understand the question correctly. But it's surprising that you don't recognize the Somalians as Somalians on the current picture. It's only a silhouette, and we all look like this when we are there in the dark.
Well, actually, you'd have to ask him himself. Anyway, I wanted to find out again. I'm not against narrating or reporting, and that's the problem with this picture. I mean, without narrating, you can't take any pictures, and therefore I didn't want to say, the documentary picture against a picture which is a kind of mise en scène. Any documentation is a kind of mise en scène. Nevertheless, I would like to posit that there's a difference between mise en scène and documentary or fictitious pictures. But I'd like to find out the status of the image for you or for your professions. What is it? Because you said actually placing it can help you make headway, or for instance, if you win an award, that can be helpful. And would it be possible that these pictures only have a certain function, i.e. are being made for WordPress? I used to have the idea, or maybe that's naive, these are pictures which photographers took anyway and then they send them in, but actually maybe there's a certain aestheticism or pictures which you deliberately do for WordPress. because the news, this image doesn't have any news content or information content, and it seems to be aestheticized and devoid of any kind of context. So you are left with the impression that it's supposed to be a picture unto itself. Okay, it doesn't depict a war anyway, but I mean, it is no longer related to any specific event or circumstance. So on the one hand, you still have images which still can be regarded as news images, and then on the other hand, you have a pool of images which serve aesthetic purposes, but which can be harnessed in order to pitch or to position yourself, to show me your own profile. There are certain categories where you become a producer yourselves, and the features, documentaries, which you produce are usually more time-consuming because they're long-term projects. Any freelance photographer doesn't have an awful lot of time. Of course, they definitely have 2 or 3 long-term projects allowing you to sharpen their profile by focusing on certain socio-political topics and revisit them again and again. As a result of this, logically, an oeuvre is created which is more intense and which is definitely not paid by a magazine or client, or can't be paid by a magazine or client, because it usually lasts for several months or years. But usually those are the kind of pieces of work which receive an award, because you've got more time on your hands, and photography, like any other journalist work, depends on access, and access depends on confidence-building measures, and all of these aspects are time-consuming and costly, and you can't achieve them overnight, let alone within 2 weeks. I mean, if you get 2 weeks awarded by a newsroom, nowadays you're even in a privileged situation. So you can't even achieve it over 2 weeks. So those pictures which receive an award are usually freelance produced. And by receiving an award for your own pictures, you hope to canvas more work as somebody who won an award, and to sharpen your profile, to become more visible in the freelance pool, and then you will be able to cross-subsidize the next freelance project on which you're working anyway. Let's get back to your Kundus book, which made you very famous, together with Christoph Reuter, the Stern journalist, which is like the Time magazine. Now, there's one element. We spoke about the aestheticization of the pictures, and maybe that's, okay, open to criticism, therefore we can move away from that topic fairly quickly, but nevertheless there are many points in case for keeping on taking pictures. I think nobody said here at this conference, stop taking pictures. Therefore, apparently there is a rationale for taking pictures, but you can take pictures for very different reasons. And one of the motive or rationales for taking pictures, which is mentioned very often, is, for instance, giving a voice or giving an image to somebody or something which usually is not covered in regular news reporting. This is also the subject of your Kundus book. I'd like to show you a drastic picture. Iraq War, 1991, Kenneth Reedy, American photojournalist. There was a lengthy discussion concerning this picture. Most magazines turned this down. And then Observer published it with the headline, The Real Face of War. And maybe the headline already goes straight to the heart of my point here, i.e. you should not listen to the official news coverage, but you should have a look at the real face. This soldier was burned in his tank within seconds during a major attack. The photographer then published it with another headline. If I don't publish in another magazine, if I don't publish this, people like my mom will think war is what we see on TV. So basically the message for these pictures behind these pictures is drawing attention to certain things which usually go unnoticed. Now, my question is, was this also part of the motivation for your Kunduz project? You mentioned your book is about attack. Your book is about civilians being killed with all the political consequences, which we all know. The defense minister stepped down and all of these affairs surrounding that. And maybe Mr. Reuter made that statement, but in the book it said, we want to draw a picture of those people who lost their lives. And in terms of the layout, on the left-hand side you see pictures of the persons who lost their lives, sometimes personal IDs or family pictures, and on the right-hand side you see a family member. And I think this is about making something overt, which is like a Gegenbild, which is like a counter-image, and which is usually papered over through the official news reporting. Yes, we try to use the tradition of the remembrance culture. Basically, it was like detective work. We wanted to find out how many people lost their lives. Briefly before the elections in 2009 and 2010, the Afghan context became relegated. There was a domestic trench war going on. And we wanted to take a step back and take a look at the number of people who are being killed. So there was something between 17 and 72 people killed. And then we spoke to lots of dependents, family members, and after a couple of weeks we found out how many people really died. And my task was taking pictures. Initially I wanted to use the jargon of the documentary, and this was too dangerous, however, because the Germans had just created a big mess, and therefore we were better advised in keeping a local profile. Therefore, we invited the villagers to where we were staying, and I didn't have lots of tools to use the jargon of the documentary. Usually you would spend more time covering their day-to-day work, and so it was a very classical work, portrait photography, very stylized, clean images. But at the end, when I made a show, it worked very well, because in an artistic context I could work with living people. They went to the exhibition and saw big images, and they first of all needed to ask themselves, are they the people who are dead, or how come they look so lively, up until they moved to the next room and where they saw the juxtaposition with the visual remnants of the deceased person and the family member, plus a few sketchy pieces of information concerning the deceased person. And this is when it actually filtered through to them. So this is what we did. We adopted the remembrance tradition. So very sober portraits of Afghan men, no women, and the past pictures or the personal ID pictures of the dead, of the deceased. A very naive question. You could only take pictures of the male family members? Yes, it's a male culture in that context. You were not allowed to take pictures of women. Oh. I'd be curious to find out what you think about it. I mean, we also have a countervailing discourse. We mentioned points in case, why it's important to show pictures, and you also said it's important to put a name to the person. You know, actually also we should give, we should not just feature celebrities, we should give a name to even these rather unknown persons. So sometimes you also had remnants and you couldn't really identify them, but then there are also arguments or deliberations going on, and they say, we don't need more images, we need less images. So we've already got a plethora of images, is what some people say. let me show you two images, which, interestingly enough, come from an artistic setting, but actually only semi-artistic. This is a work made by Alfredo Jarre. This is a Chilean artist who initially started, I don't know whether you know him, he set out as a war photographer. He went to Rwanda in 1992, 1 year, and took hundreds of pictures. And this is when he decided he doesn't want to show these pictures. Because he says, why? What's the point? We cater to a kind of voyeurism. And he said, what's the point? Why should I circulate these images? And of course you can argue whether this is art or not, and this is not the point I want to make, but he prepared a cemetery of images. This is what you see in the boxes here. In the boxes you allegedly have the photographies. Maybe it's not, but I mean, it also plays on the ambiguity here. And on these boxes in the white writing, it tells you what would have been on the picture. This is Benjamin in this church, that many victims, etc. So that means you have an image in your mind, but of course, this thrives on the non-overtness. So the images are there, but it's precisely not to circulate them. What's so special about it? What do you think about this as an idea? I'm not mentioning this because I want to mention art in this context, but because his background is a photojournalism, and he's a photojournalist by training, and he said, I deliberately refrained from publishing the pictures. Can you agree with that? I think it's at least intriguing. It's interesting. Of course, it's a smart move, entering a completely new artistic scene and making a name for yourself. It's part of a strategy, and it's very original. And this is how art works. And in the artistic context, you need to be able to showcase a clear meta level. This is definitely the case in this scenario. I don't know whether I would embrace the same tactic. Images. I mean, I think images are intriguing. I think they're exciting. So I can understand where it's coming from. You're a photojournalist, and you know how difficult the business is, how complex it is to get the green light for publishing your own stories. So I think it's understandable that 10, 15 years after being in the job, you try to tap a new scene, try to get a foot in the door of the artistic scene. No, it wasn't a professional career advice. And I'd also like to, point out it can't be a solution. I think it's legitimate. It's perfectly all right for him to do that. He does that with lots of pieces of work. But I think it's a way out. But it doesn't resolve the issues. He just shifts it to a different scenario. He says, okay, I'll move away from photojournalism, I'll become an artist instead. But the thing is, the moral finger-pointing that he usually engages in, that's a bit of an issue. And it's supposed to look like a cemetery, I suppose. At least the kind of lighting effect suggests this. Again, it's remembrance in the Protestant, but not in the Catholic version or reading. Anyway, but you mentioned something which made me think. And I think that was mentioned on one of the panels yesterday too. Every rebel faction nowadays has its own spin doctors, has its own specialists for imagery, for videos, motion pictures, which of course can create a major effect in its brief clips because they create a completely different take on reality and because they're being seen on small screens. You are a specialist for pictures and for shooting films. In your view, in how far are your colleagues' pictures different from the pictures of the spin doctors of the various warring factions? Again, this is a Gegenbild. It is something that is supposed to be the answer, the correct narrative element. It's supposed to maximize attention, draw attention to a certain event. How good are they? Coming from your own background, would you be able to detect these pictures straight away as such, or are the boundaries blurred, both in terms of images and videos? Well, they're becoming better. I think, in the Arab context, Arab Spring, we're talking about the emergence of completely new phenomena. Social platforms are being used excessively and very often very successfully by young people who really know what they're doing, indeed. So that's the context within which we as photographers come to a country, and we need to justify our raison d'etre, why we are there. So this is what I tried to answer when the question was put. There's a journalist motivation, so we're not there because of one of the parties. We're impartial observers, and we're also more difficult to intimidate. Yes, perhaps, yes. So that is the reason why we're going there. Now, you mentioned the spin doctors. I think the key difference is the following. Hardly ever has the competition between images become so evident as over the past 2 years during which I've been active. For instance, funding of images, Syria. What about all these worrying factions? How did they emerge in a country where there is a very asymmetrical balance of power? Every individual street needed to fight for itself. So you had lots and lots of local heroes, a very heterogeneous picture. These local heroes then became the amalgamation point for many different people, and they all become one of the focal points, and they need funds. Well, you can obtain funds by attracting funds which come from outside, be it Qataris or be it Syrians in exile, by whomever. So basically, you need to advertise yourselves. You need to sharpen your profile, and that profile is sharpened by shooting images of yourselves and promoting success stories. There are certain channels on the internet which are used for airing this whole imagery for marketing purposes in order to raise funds. At the same time, simultaneously, there's a very interesting phenomenon. I thought that was very interesting. Civil journalism gets a foot in the door in a news station such as Al Jazeera. So for Syria only, Al Jazeera created a station, Al Jazeera Live. Al Jazeera Live, again, aired all video feeds which they got by people's mobile phones, by people on the street. So they aired it automatically. So when the Syrian resistance could no longer, launch a major rally, but when there were lots of motley, heterogeneous, small-scale rallies, these protesters filmed themselves, and they then projected them on the feed to Al Jazeera, and then Al Jazeera plays lots of different feeds, Aleppo, Homs, etc. So the backbone became evident for the backbone of the Syrian revolution. So that was a user-generated content, civil journalism, which created this backbone, and together with the major cooperation of an international powerful news station. So the news station decided to provide a platform for user-generated content. There was no editor saying we're not going to air this, and this kind of inspired people to keep keep soldiering on, because they knew, okay, maybe going is getting tough for us, but people down the road are just taking to the streets as much as we are, and we are all in this together. So they created a kind of solidarity which was unprecedented. And basically, a journalistic big player clearly took sides. In the Arab context, journalism was always seen as a tool for achieving your political goals, for communicating your political objectives. Basically, journalism always used to form part of the spin doctor machine for the powers that be for many, many years. And that is a completely different approach than the one embraced in the Western Hemisphere. The images which we create are not prepared for their audience. Our context is a Western Hemisphere context, although this sounds very bluntly. Or let's put it this way, the user-generated content in Syria is prepared for the Arab context, which is more important than the Western one. Do they look different in terms of aestheticism? Well, you have music in the background, you get the heroic a heroic idiom. So anything which wouldn't work in Germany or in Europe is being used there. There's a clear tendency here. Of course, you can criticize this. You could say, well, you're not supposed to do it this way. But as a matter of fact, it's a reality. I think it becomes very clear. You know, how far divorced this is from the war journalism of La Capa. With Capa, you have the impression that there are too many individual images. I mean, the soldier in the Spanish Civil War or the landing in the Normandy, these are icons. But what you say is something completely different. It's like grassroots pictures, lots of pictures. It's like a flood of pictures. It's quantity. It's not like masterpieces with well-composed masterpieces. And that kind of is very telling about the difference between these two categories. Well, it's a phenomenon which emerged now, but actually which was always around, but whenever you try to implement it top down, it didn't work. But the fact that every man on the street became part of that machinery is new and was very interesting to witness in that part of the world. Simultaneity. Just think back to the Wehrmacht's exhibition. Many amateur pictures were shown with a certain delay. So there was also user-generated content with regard to the Nazi generation here and the Wehrmacht-Ausstellung. But anyway, now it's already, there is no longer this time like now. We have simultaneous pictures, or the Gaddafi imagery. The pictures of Gaddafi's death. It was also user-generated content, wasn't it? Yes. Rebels. Yeah. Okay. You mentioned it on various occasions. Or let's get back, to the subject of film. Just said, film means you don't just have one image and that image has to tell everything, but you can have a trajectory here. It can unfold. You can hear voices. You can ask people. And this is your vision. This is what's more intriguing for you right now. Maybe you can elaborate this further. The scope provided in your view by film, by motion pictures as opposed to still images. It's my personal preference. I came to the conclusion that I'm intrigued by motion pictures. And what drew me to these regions is not necessarily the subject of the Arab region, which has been on my radar for the past 13 or 14 years anyway. But if you're interested in history, it's very interesting to go to a setting which is in disarray, where you get stories which you wouldn't get in your own backyard. This is what I can just say about it right now. And with regard to film, I thought it was very interesting. This is where it's early days for me. I just did a 60-minute film. I think it's very interesting that you can work with atmosphere, with time, with pauses. So therefore, for me, films are much more exciting as a tool than photography, where you need to focus literally on one thing or just on a short series. So I think film is a nice new sandbox for me. The film, The Children of Homes, accompanies a couple of children and shows their life in this war-ridden zone. And it strikes you that you hardly see any corpses in the short version. But in the other version, you see a couple of drastic images to begin with, where rebels are pushed into a stream with their eyes blindfolded. But it's a deliberate decision where you narrate a film without using the atrocious pictures as a peg. So that was a deliberate decision, wasn't it? Yes, it was a deliberate decision. When I noticed that in Syria, many children have to assume tasks which apparently, or that children fill the void which is left by the adults. I mean, children are taken from their daily context. Like there's a hero of the revolution. He's 13 years and he's a poster boy, and he leads the rally. And when he has a headache, the rally doesn't take place. Protesters stay at home, and he became like the icon, the lighthouse for an entire city. And this 13-year-old boy, he has the face of a 40-year-old man, and he's still in the body of the 13-year-old boy, and he presents the vision of an adult, and he has this incredible personality. And I contrast this with the tranquility of a small family, 3 little girls living on the front line because their father is one of the top leaders of one of the combat units of the Syrian front. So these are the children which I accompany over several days and watch them play. So you see this innocence which, however, is eroded by the catastrophic scenario. Is that difficult? To place the film somewhere, to sell it, because it's a 1-hour film, isn't it?
The format is not that easy to digest. I was commissioned to do this, so it wasn't my problem.